Hi guys, and I'm Comrade Darkslayer here. Hi guys, I'm Comrade Darkslayer here, and in this documentary, it's about 9/11 and how 9/11 led to more false flag attacks. But I think 9/11 was the start of the 9/11 of the false flags to come. In this documentary, we'll explore very in depth about 9/11 and the truth about 9/11, and I hope you enjoy. And we're going to explore all the depths of 9/11, the most important aspects of 9/11, all the important details of 9/11. I'll go on and on. Because 9/11 was the false flag that started it all. And it was the kind of false flag that led to like two illegal, unconstitutional wars. Two wars and those wars were based on lies, by the way. And it led to the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act took American civil liberties and took people's rights away and expanded surveillance powers, and American citizens were spied on. I'll go on and on. So 9/11 led to a lot of events. 9/11 led to a lot of things in America that made it more into a police state. Because of 9/11, we are now a totalitarian state. So that's why 9/11 is so important historically speaking. So in this video documentary, we're going to explore the truth of 9/11, and I hope you enjoy.
On the very day of September 11, several commentators drew a parallel with the historical events of Pearl Harbor.
And it's a day that will, as was the case with Pearl Harbor, live in infamy in American history.
The last time there was an attack like this on the United States was Pearl Harbor.
Reminiscent of another terrible day, the attack on Pearl Harbor.
But there was also someone on the same day who offered a prediction.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, guess what we did? We went back and found out that, yes, the evidence was there. We should have known. And again, I think what we're going to see, even in this instance, this Pearl Harbor of the 21st century is very much the same kind of thing.
In fact, the more information that has been emerging about September 11, the more we have come to realize that many different aspects of the two events bear a chilling resemblance to each other. While both events were needed by the U.S. to go to war, in both cases, the ultimate goal was not the one initially stated.
Roosevelt knew a surprise Japanese attack would enrage the public and jumpstart the American war machine. In this way, FDR would get backdoor entry into what he really wanted: war with Hitler.
According to their own documents, before 9/11, the neocons knew that a surprise attack, like a new Pearl Harbor, would enrage the public and jumpstart the war machine against Afghanistan. In this way, they would get a backdoor entry into what they really wanted: the war with Saddam Hussein.
From the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
He says that going after Saddam Hussein was topic A 10 days after the inauguration, 8 months before September 11th.
Before and during the war, the propaganda machine made a relentless effort to create a direct connection between Hitler and Japan.
One poll taken immediately after Pearl Harbor showed that more than 60% of Americans believed that Germany was behind the attack.
The Bush-Cheney propaganda machine made an even harder effort to create a direct association between Iraq and Osama bin Laden. By the end of 2003, nearly 70% of Americans believed that Saddam was implicated in the September 11 attacks. Top levels of the Roosevelt administration knew in advance that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked.
General Marshall and Admiral Stark, and indeed FDR, indeed knew that Pearl Harbor was being painted for a bombing run by the Japanese.
Secretary of State Cordell Hull even knew the exact day of the attack, a week before it took place.
Cordell Hull was Secretary of State, and he called me on Saturday morning and he started to relate that Pearl Harbor would be attacked on December the 7th.
Before September 11, many in the intelligence community knew the attacks were on their way.
There was so much discussion about this attack. Everybody was talking about it. George Tenet had some meetings. Other analysts had meetings at the White House.
Vital information on the Japanese attack was kept from those who could have used it to defend the Hawaiian port and to minimize the number of American casualties.
Two men could use that information immediately: Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short, the commanders at Pearl Harbor. But they never get it. According to Hill, that was no mistake.
If FDR and his administration deliberately withheld the vital intelligence from Pearl Harbor, and all the evidence indicates that they did, then it was certainly a deliberate conspiracy to set Pearl Harbor up for a total defeat.
Before September 11, important information was kept from counterterrorism czar Richard Clark, who could have organized a defense and even have prevented the attacks altogether.
You have to intentionally stop it. You have to intervene and say, no, I don't want that report to go. We therefore conclude that there was a high-level decision in the CIA ordering people not to share that information.
In both cases, the pre-knowledge by the U.S. government on the upcoming attacks was denounced in front of Congress.
In September 1944, Republican Representative Forrest Harness of Indiana made the first congressional charge about a Pearl Harbor conspiracy. He said that 3 days before Pearl Harbor, the Australian government had warned Washington that a Japanese aircraft carrier was headed towards Hawaii. But, he said, that information was withheld from Kimmel and Short.
After September 11, Republican Congressman Curt Weldon denounced the pre-knowledge of information on the upcoming attacks, which was intentionally withheld from the intelligence community.
This is an attempt to prevent the American people from knowing the facts about how we could have prevented 9/11, and people are covering it up today.
When honest officials stumbled on important information on the Japanese attack, they went straight to their superiors, only to see that information ignored, diverted, or suppressed altogether.
The Chief of Naval Intelligence in Washington, Captain Alan Kirk, recognized the message as plans for a bombing raid, but his persistent attempts to warn Kimmel ended when he was assigned to other duties. At Pearl Harbor, the Admiral had no way of knowing that Kirk had been repeatedly refused permission to warn him.
In August 2001, FBI agent Colleen Rowley discovered information that could have led to uncover the September 11 plot. But her memos never got past her superiors, while she was prevented from pursuing the investigation any further.
Finally, it turns out they were not read by the lawyer in the FBI who had the duty to send those over to the Department of Justice.
Hours before the Japanese strike, Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, George Marshall, became suddenly unavailable, delaying the process of communication within the chain of command.
General George Marshall, the man who should have acted, was nowhere to be found. Colonel Rufus Bratton was responsible for keeping Marshall supplied with such vital information. For Bratton, Marshall's sudden unavailability at a time when America was on the brink of war could not have been accidental.
In the crucial hours of September 11, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and other top military became suddenly unavailable, hampering the decisional process within the chain of command.
For 30 minutes, we couldn't find him.
Withholding information, however, may not have been sufficient to guarantee the success of the Japanese attack. The military capacity of the Hawaiian port was also kept below its requirements.
General Short, faced with the need to send out long-range patrols, had only a handful of suitable aircraft. His demands for more were not seen as a priority.
On September 11, only 4 jets remained on alert to defend the entire sector of the country most likely to suffer an attack.
I've determined, of course, that with only 4 aircraft, we cannot defend the whole northeastern United States.
President Roosevelt gave direct orders not to interfere with the Japanese attack.
President Roosevelt told General Marshall to send a message to the Hawaiian and Philippine commanders, don't interfere with Japan's overt act of war. The United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act.
There's no argument about what FDR meant. He meant that the U.S. naval plan to defend Pearl Harbor should not and cannot be executed.
On September 11, Vice President Cheney gave a direct order regarding the plane headed towards Washington, which in fact resulted in the plane reaching its target without being shot down.
The young man said, Vice President, the plane's 10 miles out. Do the orders still stand? And the Vice President sort of whipped his head around and said, of course they do.
It was thanks to the indignation for the 3,000 sailors killed at Pearl Harbor that President Roosevelt could finally enter a war the U.S. had been preparing for months in advance.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
It was thanks to the indignation for the 3,000 victims of September 11 that President Bush could launch a war that had already been prepared in the smallest detail. CNN and Time magazine have reported that on September 10, 2001, a military plan to attack Afghanistan had been placed on George Bush's desk to be signed by the president upon his return from Florida.
May God grant us wisdom, and may He watch over the United States of America.
Then came the official commissions, which in both cases were tasked to find out whether there had been a conspiracy by the same authorities that were suspected of having participated in the conspiracy.
Just 3 months after VJ Day, Senator Alvin Barkley of Kentucky convenes the Joint Congressional Committee on the investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack. The committee lays much of the blame on the commanders at Pearl Harbor and largely exonerates FDR and his top advisors. But its conclusions draw charges of cover-up and cronyism.
Gross negligence becomes high treason when the motive is discovered or understood.
In July 2004, the Commission published its final report.
2.5 million pages of documents. We've interviewed over 1,200 individuals, including experts and officials past and present.
However, the Commission report failed to meet many of the family's expectations and concluded that 9/11 was merely a failure of imagination.
Published in 2004, the 9/11 Commission report has become the central focus of criticism by the 9/11 Truth Movement, a movement comprised of thousands of individuals and associations from all over the world, all connected through the Internet. The Commission's report is accused of having simply rubber-stamped the government's version of the events by ignoring all the evidence against it, while covering up its most conspicuous holes with a long series of omissions, distortions, and even plain falsehoods. Led by researcher David Ray Griffin, an international panel of 20 experts on 9/11 has compiled a list of the strongest evidence against the official version that has emerged to this day. This evidence is available to the public on their website in 4 different languages. Despite all the
500 primary radar blips. They were trying to pick out the plane that they just lost.
Non sapevano dove andare perché i terroristi hanno disattivato un dispositivo che si chiama transponder che localizza l'aeroplano. Spento quello, puff, sparisce il puntino. E dov'è? Non si sa dove è finito.
This is not true. When the transponder is turned off, the controllers lose the information on the altitude, but they can still track the plane as a primary signal. The following example shows how long it took an air traffic controller to find American 11 on his screen after he was told the plane had been hijacked.
Good morning, Washington. I got a situation here with American 11. We believe it's a possible hijack.
Okay, tell me more.
We lost radio communications with him, then we lost his transponder, and right now the aircraft is just west of Albany going southbound.
Okay, I see him.
United 175 never turned the transponder off. It just switched codes.
United 175 is 50 miles northwest of New York City when its transponder code is suddenly changed.
As I look up, I notice that United 175's code has changed. I just turned around and radioed the pilot. My exact words were, United 175, recycle transponder squawk.
Hijacker Al-Shehhi obviously intended to turn off that transponder, but because he just changed codes and didn't turn it off, he still left the controllers with a very clear indication of the normal return from an aircraft that was squawking, that's what we call it, with the altitude.
According to the Secret Service, the plane that hit the Pentagon was tracked for at least 30 minutes before it reached Washington.
Nelson Garabito was the Secret Service agent in charge of protecting the White House airspace.
First thing I did is I picked up the phone to call my contact, the FAA. He said we have 4 planes outstanding. 2 have hit the towers, and 2 are headed to Washington, D.C. One of them approximately 30 minutes out, one of them approximately 45 minutes out.
The one 30 minutes out turned out to be the plane that hit the Pentagon.
As the one nearest us got closer and closer, 6 minutes out, 5 minutes out, we knew it was sort of over the CIA, and we thought, is that where it's going? but it kept coming.
United 93 was also being tracked after the hijacking.
We were tracking United 93, and I was in conversation with the FBI agent, and he was relaying to me that we suspect that this aircraft has now been taken over by hostile forces, described the sharp turn it made over eastern Ohio, and now is heading back along southwestern Pennsylvania.
The airplane was being followed step by step, practically in real time.
Right now, he is west of Johnstown still, 12 miles.
At some point, it even turned the transponder back on, showing not only its position, but also the altitude.
It looks like he's still turning. Hey, his transponder just came back on and it was showing 8,000 feet, 200. 8,200 feet? 8,200 feet, and he's on the same code that he was before.
Save for some moments of confusion, the 4 airplanes were being tracked by air traffic controllers all along. The real reason for the failure to intercept the 4 aircraft seems to have been the high number of military exercises that were being run by NORAD on September 11 out of their base in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. As Webster Tarpley noted in his book 9/11 Synthetic Terror, staff exercises or command exercises are perfect for a rogue network, which is forced to conduct its operations using the same communications and computer systems used by other officers who are not necessarily party to the illegal operation. Interestingly enough, on the evening of September 10th, the security level for the NORAD computer system called Infocon had been dropped to normal, the lowest level. This made it easier for anyone to penetrate or compromise the computer networks of the air defense system. On September 11, between 4 and 10 military exercises had been scheduled, some of them involving false hijacks of commercial airplanes. This unusual number of exercises had 2 major consequences. 1, they moved a large number of fighters out to Canada and Alaska. 2, they created a major confusion in the system as soon as the real hijackings were reported.
We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys to, we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
The process of authorization for scrambles was lengthy and complicated.
Hey, I just talked to Otis here, and they said they needed a NIADS authorization.
Confusion and pressure kept mounting.
I don't know where I'm scrambling these guys to. I need a direction, destination.
At times, communications were jammed.
If you could do me a favor and have them call us, we cannot call out for some reason.
Some in the military quickly realized the simulations were causing a problem.
You know, let's get rid of this goddamn sim. Hey, turn the sim switches off. Get rid of that crap.
I hope they cancel the exercise because this is ridiculous.
But they were not canceled. Even after both towers in New York had been hit, when everyone knew America was under attack, the war games continued.
You guys watching the news?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. I've been watching it for about 10 minutes. They suspend the exercise now?
Not at this time, no.
Apparently, someone took advantage of the situation. While the plane headed for the Pentagon was quickly approaching from the west, an unknown source, which was never identified, reported that American 11 was headed towards the Capitol even though the plane had already crashed into the North Tower.
I just had a report that American 11 is still in the air and it's heading towards Washington.
American 11 is still in the air?
This attracted all the attention towards the so-called Phantom plane.
He's still airborne, he's still a hijack out there, but we can't get a position on him.
The jets from Langley were prepared to intercept it.
I don't know if they might want to alert some aircraft down there, though, too.
We have Langley on battle stations right now.
Okay.
Then they were scrambled straight for Washington.
Foxy, scramble Langley, head towards the Washington area. Roger that.
But a different command post, called Giant Killer, sent the fighters out to the ocean.
Say again where you want him?
We want him in the Whiskey 386 area.
This didn't sit well with the operations center.
Frickin' Giant Killer and their wisdom sent him out over the water when we scrambled him to Washington.
By the time the plane headed for the Pentagon was circling the Capitol, it was too late for the Langley jets to intercept it. Even after the Pentagon was hit, the war games were not suspended. And again, while United 93 was being hijacked, another false alarm attracted the attention in the opposite direction.
Did you get the word? I got a Delta 89er southeast of Toledo.
Delta 89, that's a hijack. They think it's possible hijack. Fuck, south of Cleveland, we have a code on him now. Good, pick it up, find it. Fuck, another one.
Major Nazipany turned to Toledo Air Force Base.
I'm sorry to be so brief and quick on this, but there's another possible hijack about 50 miles east of Toledo, and you guys are the closest, and we need somebody airborne.
But instead of getting help, his authority was questioned.
What authority is this coming from?
What authority is this coming from? The DO, is the best I can tell you.
Nazipany vented his frustration to his superior, Colonel Marr.
He's going to tell his commander, the commander's going to call you, because he doesn't believe the authority.
Then they tried Duluth Air Force Base.
What about Duluth? Okay, Duluth, you got no fighters.
Nazipany went all the way to the western quadrant looking for help.
This is Major Cheney. Who is this?
Hey, Kenny. This is Nasty. How you doing?
Hey, doing all right.
Hey, we're not doing so good right now. What I'd like to do, possibly steal some aircraft out of Fargo from you guys.
But here, too, there were no planes ready for scramble.
They're going to get 2 aircraft up in about 15 minutes.
They tried Syracuse, but 20 minutes was the best they could do.
Syracuse 2 airborne in 20 minutes.
They tried Alpena, but the planes were just returning from their training.
The Alpena thing isn't what we thought. There's 4 guys coming home from the range right now.
They started looking for planes that were already up in the air for exercises.
So, anybody in training, send them home. These moving missions of Falcon, send them home.
But those planes were spent at that point.
They got no weapons. They just go around and straight around up to the range. They blew all their load.
By the time refueled and armed jets were finally scrambled, the Delta flight turned out to be another false alarm.
He was a hijacked aircraft. He is not a hijacked aircraft. He's taken precautionary measures and he's landing at Cleveland Center.
Only after the Delta flight had landed were the war games finally suspended.
Hello, this is Captain Taylor calling from China Mountain Control.
Yes.
What we need you to do right now is to terminate all exercise inputs coming into Cheyenne Mountain.
By then, also the 4th hijacked airplane had been turned into a pile of smoking rubble. Yet General Myers, who was the highest military authority on September 11, has denied that the war games affected the military capacity of response.
And the question was whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response.
General Myers forgot to mention that on the morning of September 11, only 4 planes were armed and ready to intercept terrorists in the eastern region of the country.
I've determined, of course, that with only 4 aircraft, we cannot defend the whole northeastern United States. That was the sensation of frustration, of I don't have the forces available to do anything about this.
Myers instead has even suggested that the war games helped the military response.
General Eberhart, who was then the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, as he testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, I believe he told them that it enhanced our ability to respond. What that means is all the battle positions that are normally not filled are indeed filled. So it was an easy transition from an exercise into a real-world situation.
Again, Myers forgot to mention that the transition took place only after all tragic events had ended, around 11 o'clock.
By 11 o'clock, the sense of alarm had spread across the country. Fighter jets actually patrolling the skies.
It was a war zone. Our skies were turned into a war zone. Everywhere you turn, it was military jets and helicopters everywhere.
George Bush returned to Washington on the evening of September 11.
The president finally returns to Washington. An escort of 6 helicopters was waiting for him. 300 fighters were defending the skies.
Had there been 300 fighters ready to defend the skies on the morning of September 11, would the terrorist attacks have turned out the same way? This leads us straight into a pivotal question. Was the choice of scheduling so many exercises in the same day just a misfortunate call, or was it intentional? To answer this question, we need to take a closer look at some of the warnings the U.S. had received in the months prior to September 11.
By the spring of 2001, the system was blinking red, according to intelligence chiefs.
The U.S. administration has always maintained that they knew the attacks were on their way, but they didn't have specific information on them.
I knew there was another attack planning. I knew there was another attack coming. And the obvious question behind that is, well, why didn't you do something about it? We had no specific information.
It was not specific as to time, nor place, nor manner of attack.
No specific threat involving really domestic operation or involving what happened, obviously, the city's airliner and so forth.
There were no warning signs that I'm aware of that would indicate this type of operation in the country.
All these statements are false. A joint congressional inquiry on September 11 has revealed that in spring and summer of 2001, there had been a flood of warnings about possible terrorist attacks in the United States, some using airplanes as weapons. In fact, as reported by the New York Times, American aviation officials were warned as early as 1998 that Al-Qaeda could seek to hijack a commercial jet and slam it into a U.S. landmark. The London Times has revealed that the British MI6 had warned the American intelligence services about a plot to hijack aircraft and crash them into buildings 2 years before the September 11 attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said publicly that he ordered his intelligence agencies to alert the United States last summer in 2001 that suicide pilots were training for attacks on U.S. targets. German intelligence alerted the CIA in June 2001 that Middle Eastern terrorists were training for hijackings. The Sunday Herald has confirmed that Britain gave President Bush a categorical warning to expect multiple airline hijackings 1 month before the September 11 attacks. Then there was the infamous August 6th memo.
President Bush was told in August that Osama bin Laden might be planning an attack involving the hijacking of U.S. aircraft.
It's titled, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. The 2-page memo states, FBI information indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country, consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks.
Maybe it's no coincidence that the FBI advised their own boss to stop flying commercial airliners as early as 6 weeks before 9/11.
Why is the Attorney General of the United States doing all his air travel by specially chartered jet?
The Justice Department cited what it called a threat assessment by the FBI and said Ashcroft has been advised to travel only by private jet for the remainder of his term.
At this point, we can pose the following question. Knowing that the attacks were imminent, knowing that they might involve hijacked airliners, but not knowing where and when they could happen, would have been a good reason to beef up the defense and keep even more jets than usual on alert all across the country. Why instead schedule so many exercises in one day while leaving only 4 jets on alert to defend the very sector of the country that was most likely to be attacked? To bring even more confusion into the situation was a series of last-minute replacements and unexplained absences within the chain of command. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was General Henry Shelton, but on September 11 he was absent, and his post was taken by his deputy, General Richard B. Myers. The FAA's National Operations Manager was Ben Sliney. On the morning of September 11, Sliney had been on that job for less than 1 day. The protocols required for Mr. Sliney to speak directly with the hijack coordinator, Lieutenant General Mike Canavan. But Canavan on that day was in Puerto Rico, and apparently he had forgotten to designate a replacement. In regards to the ensuing confusion, Mr. Sliney has stated, "That's incredible. There is only one person. There must be someone designated or someone who will assume the responsibility of issuing an order." At the head of the National Command Center was General Montague Winfield. But on the evening of September 10th, Winfield instructed Captain Charles Leidig to take his place on the following morning. Leidig had been just recently certified for that post and was also on his first day on the job. At the Operation Command of NEADS was Colonel Marr. When Marr called his superior, General Arnold, to get authorization to scramble the jets from Otis, he was told that Arnold was in a meeting where he could not be reached by telephone. Marr had to physically send a messenger looking for him. Precious minutes were lost as Marr waited for Arnold to return his call, and when the fighters were finally scrambled, it was too late for them to intercept American 11. The top commander in charge of NORAD was General Ralph Eberhard, who was stationed at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. Eberhard told the 9/11 Commission that he was made aware of the first hijacking practically at the same time American 11 slammed into the North Tower. He then went to his office and saw the CNN broadcast of the World Trade Center explosion. After the second impact, writes the Commission, it was obvious to Eberhard that there was an ongoing and coordinated terrorist attack. At that point, Eberhard called General Myers to update him on the situation. But even though both generals knew the country was being attacked by hijacked airplanes, neither of them suggested suspending the war games and recalling all the fighters available as soon as possible. Furthermore, instead of getting on the phone and taking control of the situation, in the most crucial moment of the day, General Eberhard chose to get in his car and drive from the Peterson base to Cheyenne Mountain. The 30-minute drive put him completely out of the loop, since Eberhard couldn't receive telephone calls, wrote the Denver Post, as senior officials weighed how to respond. General Eberhard was also the person responsible for lowering the security level of the defense computer system on the evening of September 10th. And then there was Donald Rumsfeld. As stated by the 9/11 Commission, procedures called for the hijack coordinator on duty to contact the National Military Command Center and to ask for a military escort aircraft to follow the flight. The NMCC would then seek approval from the Office of the Secretary of Defense to provide military assistance. If approval was given, the order would be transmitted down NORAD's chain of command. But this kind of procedure becomes difficult to follow when the hijack coordinator is in Puerto Rico. No one knows who the replacement is. The military command is in the hands of a total rookie, and the Secretary of Defense is nowhere to be found. Donald Rumsfeld told CNN that he was informed of the Trade Center being hit some 15 minutes before the Pentagon was hit. This places the episode around 9:22 in the morning. And after the Pentagon was hit, rather than go to the command center and take charge of the situation, the Secretary of Defense chose to lend a helping hand on the Pentagon's lawn. It's almost as if Rumsfeld didn't feel the need to be informed about what was happening to his country under attack.
The Secretary of Defense is outside the burning building, while inside the Pentagon.
For 30 minutes, we couldn't find him. And just as we began to worry, he walked into the door of the National Military Command Center.
By the time Rumsfeld walked into that door, all major events had ended. In fact, Rumsfeld told the 9/11 Commission that he was just gaining situational awareness when he spoke with the Vice President at 10:39. That's more than 1.5 hours after the whole world knew that America was under attack. Why would so many rookies be placed in key positions? And why would so many top officials be either absent or unavailable on a day when so many exercises were scheduled is a question that remains to be answered. Question. After having realized that the country was being attacked by hijacked airplanes at 9:03, why didn't Eberhard immediately suspend all the war games and recall all the available jets to their bases? Why didn't Myers order him to do so after having been briefed by Eberhard on the ongoing attack? And why hasn't the 9/11 Commission ever asked either general these most fundamental questions? The final argument against the incompetence theory is offered by researcher Nafiz Ahmed.
If we try to explain it by using the incompetence theory, it doesn't make sense. For example, if it was incompetence, we would expect that there would have been a normal inquiry into what went wrong. We would have expected that there would be some kind of reprimands, that certain officials would be downgraded, or they would lose their jobs, or something would have happened to correct the situation. But we find that there has been no such reprimands at all.
Not only that didn't happen, but the opposite took place. After 9/11, most of the high-ranking people involved in this catastrophic failure were either confirmed to their posts or promoted to higher levels. Condoleezza Rice, who had misrepresented the information the government had on the attacks in a sworn testimony, kept her post as National Security Advisor and went on to become Secretary of State in the following Bush administration. General Eberhard, the NORAD commander who didn't think of recalling the war games as soon as he knew his country was under attack, was chosen to lead the newly created U.S. Northern Command, which the Department of Defense has termed the nation's premier military homeland defense organization. Donald Rumsfeld, who acted more like an estranged passerby than the Secretary of Defense, kept his post at the Pentagon and began enjoying the largest increase in military spending after the Vietnam War. Richard B. Myers, despite the total breakdown under his leadership, was promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military post in the country. On September 13, confirmation hearings were held for General Myers as if nothing ever happened, while people were still being pulled alive from the rubble at Ground Zero. While at the Pentagon, the military appeared completely aloof from the events unfolding. At the White House, the coordination activities seemed to be concentrating under the firm authority of Vice President Cheney. In fact, the so-called NORAD tapes have revealed that the White House had ground-to-air missiles of their own.
Hello there, Washington approach. Make sure that the center does not have anything above our airspace also. The Secret Service is going to start shooting at anything in the air.
I just got a call from Washington. They said that if there's anything above their airspace, the Secret Service is going to free fire.
This exchange, which took place around 10 a.m., sheds a whole new light on one of the most controversial issues of 9/11. The sworn testimony by Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta to the 9/11 Commission on May 2003. Mineta was being questioned about the events that took place in the PIOC, the underground bunker in the White House, from where Dick Cheney took charge of the situation after convincing President Bush to stay away from Washington for safety reasons. To fully understand the implications of this case, two things must be kept in mind. One is that according to the official version, Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37, while Flight United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania at 10:03. It's on this 26-minute window that hinges the whole credibility of the Vice President on his true role in the September 11 attacks. The second thing to keep in mind is that the order to shoot down civilian airliners came from the President through the Vice President only after the Pentagon had been hit.
When the third plane hit the Pentagon, the magnitude of the attacks grew dramatically. We didn't know if there were other planes that had been hijacked. So the first decision I made on Air Force One was to give our Air Force orders to shoot down commercial aircraft that did not respond.
This means that any order given before the Pentagon was hit could not have been a shoot-down order. However, as Chairman Hamilton was inquiring about the shoot-down order, something unexpected emerged from Mineta on the plane that hit the Pentagon.
And we had that order given, I think it was by the President, that authorized the shooting down of commercial aircraft that were suspected to be controlled by terrorists. Were you there when that order was given?
No, I was not. I was made aware of it during the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon. There was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Mineta's deposition posed a major problem. Since the shoot-down order was given only after the Pentagon was hit, Cheney's order sounded very much like one not to shoot down the plane. Hamilton immediately suggested that what Mineta had witnessed was also a shoot-down order.
Let me see if I understand. The plane that was headed toward the Pentagon and was some miles away, there was an order to shoot that plane down.
Well, I don't know that specifically.
Commissioner Romer picked up where Hamilton left off.
You said, if I understood you correctly, that you were not in the room when the decision was made to what you inferred was a decision made to attempt to shoot down Flight 77 before it crashed into the Pentagon. Is that correct?
I didn't know about the shooting, the order to shoot down.
Commissioner Romer then tried to suggest a different solution.
Was there another line of communication between the Vice President and you said you saw Mr. Richard Clark on your way in? Was Clark running an operations center as well on that day?
Dick was in the Situation Room.
So there was a Situation Room making decisions about what was going to happen on shoot downs as well as the PIOC?
I don't believe they were making any decisions. I think they were more information gathering from various agencies.
Could it have been in the Situation Room where somebody in the Situation Room recommended the shoot down and the Vice President agreed to that?
Commissioner Romer, I would assume that a decision of that nature would have had to be made at a much higher level than the people who were in the Situation Room.
Unable to resolve the discrepancy, the 9/11 Commission took a series of dramatic steps. Firstly, they simply excluded Mineta's testimony from the final report. In the 560 pages of the report, Norman Mineta is mentioned only once, in an unrelated circumstance. His presence in the PIOC is never even acknowledged, and the video segment you have just seen has been removed from the Commission's official website, and it's no longer available. Secondly, the 9/11 Commission moved Dick Cheney's arrival in the PIOC to after the Pentagon had been hit. From the final report we read, the Vice President entered the underground tunnel leading to the shelter at 9:37, which is the same time the Pentagon was hit. The commission stated that Dick Cheney remained in the tunnel for more than 20 minutes trying to complete a call to the President, and that he only entered the PIOC at 9:58. Why would the Vice President spend more than 20 minutes in a tunnel trying to make a phone call when the PIOC is fully equipped with all kinds of telephones has never been explained. As a third step, the commission moved the exchange with the young man to after 10 o'clock and rewrote it in order to reconcile it with the official version. From the final report we read, at some time between 10:10 and 10:15, a military aide told the Vice President and others that the aircraft was 80 miles out. Vice President Cheney was asked for authority to engage the aircraft. The military aide returned a few minutes later and said the aircraft was 60 miles out. He again asked for authorization to engage. The Vice President again said yes. In summary, the window of time Mineta described as during the time of the plane coming into the Pentagon had become 10:10 to 10:15 in the Commission report. The 50 miles out reference by Mineta had become 80 and 60 miles out in the report. The 30 miles out and 10 miles out mentions by Mineta were removed, and the unspecified order by Dick Cheney to the young man had become a straightforward shoot-down order. And now that the episode had been moved to after 10 o'clock, the Commission could maintain that the exchange Mineta had witnessed was referring to Flight 93 when the shoot-down order was already in place, and not to the flight that hit the Pentagon. There was only one problem with this version of the events. Norman Mineta had to be terribly confused in his recollections, as he could not have been with the Vice President in the PIOC at the time the Pentagon was hit. To support this theory, the debunkers point at a statement by Mineta, who said he arrived at the White House while it was being evacuated. Since the official order of the evacuation came at 9:45, contend the debunkers, Mineta could not have been with the Vice President in the PIOC at the time the Pentagon was hit.
Stanno evacuando la Casa Bianca quando ci sono arrivato. Quindi questa informazione ci permette di localizzare cronologicamente il momento in cui Mineta è entrato a Casa Bianca.
But in the same deposition, Mineta also stated that he arrived at the PIOC at about 9:20 a.m. So it's presumable that he was referring to the people that had already started leaving the White House before the official order of evacuation was given. In fact, at 9:52, CNN reported that a slow evacuation of the White House had started some 30 minutes earlier, much before the official order was given. But the main problem with placing Cheney's removal from his office at 9:37 is Dick Cheney himself. On September 16, 5 days after the events, Cheney stated on Meet the Press that he was taken into the bunker shortly after the second tower was hit, which happened at 9:03.
So we turned on the television and watched for a few minutes and then actually saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. I talked to the president while I was there over the next several minutes watching developments on television, and as we started to get organized to figure out what to do, my Secret Service agents came in, and they hoisted me up and moved me very rapidly down the hallway, down some stairs, through some doors, and down some more stairs into an underground facility. And they did that because they'd received a report that an airplane was headed for the White House.
There are also several highly credible testimonies that place Dick Cheney's removal from his office shortly after 9:03. ABC News quoted White House photographer David Borer saying that just after 9 a.m., Vice President Dick Cheney was in his West Wing office when 2 or 3 agents came in and told him, "Sir, you have to come with us."
Agents came inside the office and said, "Sir, you have to come with us."
The New York Times reported the same story. At 9:03 a.m., as Vice President Cheney was staring at the TV screen, the second hijacked airliner exploded against the Twin Towers. At that moment, the Secret Service grabbed him and hurried him down to PIOC. Richard Clarke, in his book Against All Enemies, wrote that soon after the second tower was hit, Cheney began to gather up his papers. "As I left, I counted 8 Secret Service agents ready to move to the PIOC." President Bush's secretary, Ashley Estes, stated, "As the second plane hit, it didn't really click exactly what happened. Then I heard a noise, like a body bumping a door. I looked out into a hallway and saw the Vice President with the Secret Service. They had kind of lifted him up and were running with him. At that point, it definitely registered what it was." Former Undersecretary of Defense Eric Edelman testified, "I was already down in the PIOC with the Vice President when we got word there had been an explosion at the Pentagon." And even after 10 years, Dick Cheney has not changed his story one bit.
As we watched, we saw the second plane strike, and then we knew it was a terrorist attack. Then my Secret Service agent, lead agent, came bursting through the door of my office and said, "Sir, we have to leave now."
While all these testimonies clearly placed Dick Cheney in the PIOC by the time the Pentagon was hit, the 9/11 Commission has admitted that the 9:37 entry time by Dick Cheney in the tunnel was based on alarm data which is no longer retrievable. And, most important of all, Mineta himself recalls being with the Vice President by the time the Pentagon was hit.
So then someone came in and said, Mr. Vice President, there's been an explosion at the Pentagon.
In the course of time, Secretary Mineta has never changed his story, repeatedly confirming both the location and the timing of the event.
And then all of a sudden, as I was talking to him, he said, I lost the bogey, lost the target. I said, well, where is it? He said, well, somewhere between Roslyn and National Airport. And about that time, someone broke into the conversation. Said, Mr. Secretary, we just had a confirmation from a Arlington County police officer saying that he saw an American Airlines plane go into the Pentagon.
That the exchange Mineta witnessed was referring to the plane that hit the Pentagon should be beyond doubt at this point. But we still don't know what was the order given by Dick Cheney to the young military, whose name turned out to be Douglas Cochran. In 2010, some researchers tracked down Mr. Cochran and asked him to clarify what the orders by Dick Cheney were. Mr. Cochran confirmed being the person involved in the exchange, but declined to elaborate. He simply stated that everything that happened on that day has been well documented. The 9/11 Commission report is the authoritative narrative on the events of 9/11. I have nothing to add. In fact, it turns out that in 2004, the 9/11 Commission did interview Douglas Cochran, military aide to the Vice President, on the inbound aircraft and on the shoot-down language used. But his interview has been withdrawn from public access, and to this day, it remains classified. While we wait for that document to be declassified, we can piece together the information we already have. 1. The sky over Washington is Class Bravo, restricted airspace. It's called Prohibited Area 56. In order to enter it, an airplane must have clearance from air traffic controllers, active two-way radio communications, and its transponder must be on. Otherwise, it's to be considered hostile and it could be shot down. 2. As explained by former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, in a time of crisis, the Washington airspace goes into an actual lockdown.
You would do what is being done, and that is closing off the entire airspace so that you, in effect, the whole Washington area is a no-fly zone, so that any planes that can't identify themselves that get into that are to be shot down.
3. The White House had ground-to-air missiles of their own.
Hello there, Washington approach. Make sure that the center does not have anything above our airspace also. The Secret Service is going to start shooting at anything in the air.
4. As the unknown airplane was approaching the protected airspace, it had no clearance from air traffic controllers, no radio communications active, and the transponder was off.
He said, we're tracking an airplane coming in, but the transponder has been turned off. So we don't have any identification on the airplane. We know it's coming in fast.
A representation of the FAA radar scope based on information obtained by 2020 shows the plane headed straight for what is known as P-56, Prohibited Airspace 56, which covers the White House and the Capitol, at a speed of about 500 miles an hour, with no radio contact whatsoever.
This made it a perfect candidate for a shoot-down, especially after 2 towers in New York had already been hit by an airplane. 5. The Secret Service had known about the incoming airplane for the last 30 minutes, so it's presumable they would have been ready to shoot it down if it became necessary.
One of them approximately 30 minutes out, one of them approximately 45 minutes out. So we knew we had some time, but little time.
Despite all this, no one moved a finger as the unknown threat kept rushing towards the Capitol.
Someone came in and said to the Vice President, there's a plane out about 50 miles out.
As the one nearest us got closer and closer, 6 minutes out, 5 minutes out.
The same person said to the Vice President, Mr. Vice President, there's a plane 30 miles out.
And then at one point, we got under a minute, and I said it's about 30 seconds out.
the Washington controllers came up on the speakerphone. They started counting down 10 miles to the White House.
The young man said, Vice President, the plane's 10 miles out. Do the orders still stand? And the Vice President sort of whipped his head around and said, of course they do.
9 miles from the White House, 8 miles to the White House, all the way down to 1 mile from the White House.
But no missile was fired. Undisturbed, the plane circled the White House and went on to strike the Pentagon, causing the death of at least 125 people between military and civilians on the ground. Question: the Secret Service knew about the incoming plane for the last 30 minutes, was following it on radar, had the means to shoot it down, and should have done so in order to protect the Capitol, but they didn't. Why? In regards to the exchange between Cheney and the young man, can you suggest anything different from an order not to shoot down the plane as it was approaching Washington's protected airspace? While the military defense leaves many unanswered questions, even more doubts arise when taking a closer look at the 19 alleged terrorists. The first problem is that apparently these guys could barely fly at all. While they are known to have taken some flight lessons with small single-engine airplanes, none of them had ever flown a jet before in their life, let alone a large commercial airliner, which is obviously a league of its own. Adam Shaw is an acrobatic pilot and a flight instructor with 6,000 hours of experience, half of which spent flying upside down.
For people who are really piss-poor student pilots, to be able to get in the cockpit of big jets and fly them as accurately as they were flown, at close to max speed, and be able to hit the trade towers.
The idea that someone could make the transition from a small single-engine plane traveling at 100 miles an hour to a commercial airliner traveling at 500 miles an hour without a long, exhaustive training is very hard to believe.
People don't realize that to hand fly an airliner at those speeds is extremely difficult, and particularly if you're a novice, because a novice that's learned in little airplanes, they over-control everything.
To justify this apparently impossible transition, the debunkers maintained that the terrorist had spent some time in flight simulators, and that the equipment they encountered in the Boeing cockpits on September 11 was similar to the simulators they had trained on. But this is false. For example, the only simulator Hani Hanjour is known to have ever trained in is the Boeing 737, an airplane designed in the 70s, with a totally different cockpit from the 757 he is alleged to have hijacked on September 11. If anything, his training would have confused him, not helped him in any way.
Hi, my name is Dave Hooper. I want to tell you a story that began with an innocent question. Back when I was just a regular guy, I'd been a career entrepreneur with some successes and failures. In other words, by this point in my life, I'd been humbled. But we were okay financially, my wife had another son on the way, and life was pretty good. That was February of 2011, which was the last normal month I'd ever have. That's when I first took a closer look at 9/11 and found something astonishing. Something that would change my life. This is the story of how one simple accidental question came to be, and how it led to another, and then another, becoming a research obsession that crashed my belief system and drove my marriage, relationships, and sanity to the brink of disaster, and how out from that brink came my awakening. You can't write or talk about it, you just have to see it to believe it, and that's why this film was born. So let's start at the beginning, when my eyes first opened. Looking into 9/11 by itself didn't bring on this spiritual awakening, but it was the first domino to fall. You're about to get a peek down the rabbit hole, but just a peek, just enough to see that there is one. So get ready, because you're going to see some things that will test your beliefs and your notion of reality. So why don't we ease into it? Because you know what it's like when you first open your eyes after a deep sleep. That first light can be intense. My awakening began with a simple question. It occurred as I watched a familiar clip of President Bush on the morning of 9/11. I didn't realize it then, but this question was about to change my life. Bush is sitting at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida at 9:05 a.m. when White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers into the president's ear.
A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack.
That first question was, why didn't the Secret Service get him out of there immediately? They didn't know how many planes were hijacked yet or what their targets were.
There were actually 8 planes that were hijacked.
We had 11 reports of hijacked aircraft.
There were thousands of planes still flying. As many as a dozen planes were reported hijacked at one point. And it was no secret the president was there. The school visit had been made public on September 7th, 4 days prior to 9/11. How could anyone be so sure hijackers weren't already on the way? Yet there he lingered, even after 2 more flights were confirmed hijacked, Flight 77 and Flight 93, the Pentagon and Shanksville planes respectively. Somewhere I saw a story claiming the president's camp didn't want to scare the kids at the school, and that's why he stayed, which I found hard to believe. Well-trained professionals are going to risk the balance of power in the world to spare the feelings of a few kids who routinely practice fire drills anyway? Well, I guess the answer was yes, because Bush stayed until 9:34 a.m., a full 29 minutes after it was known we were under attack. Think about that. That would have been 29 grueling minutes for everyone, especially those assigned to protect the president, wondering if some hijackers gotten ambitious, maybe changed their plans in the last few days after the school visit was made public. I guess someone high up in the president's camp must have known or thought they were safe. I mean, what else could it be? But how could anyone have known that? It had me thinking, but it wasn't a huge deal. I was more intrigued by the type of people I came across who also had similar questions about 9/11. These weren't conspiracy theorists as I pictured them. These were people in government, aviation, civil defense, architecture, science, engineering, and the military. I decided to look further. I still had no idea the impact this would have on my life. I started by refamiliarizing myself with the incident, or I should say set of incidents. Of course, we all remember the second tower being hit, but I hadn't put much thought into the other parts of that day. And soon after looking, I was reminded that there were several incredible events on 9/11. I put almost no thought into the particulars of that day for 10 years. But that was about to change. In chronological order, the official version goes like this. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists who then flew or attempted to fly those planes into 4 U.S. buildings: World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol. 3 of them were successful. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, the North Tower, at 8:46 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed after burning for less than an hour. At 10:07 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Then at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. And I barely remembered that a third building at the World Trade Center, Building 7, collapsed at 5:20 p.m. to close out the day. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, more commonly known as NIST, backed up the official government version that intense fires weakened the steel and caused all 3 buildings to fail, including Building 7, which oddly enough was not hit by an airplane, nor was it exposed to jet fuel, which is what I thought melted the towers to get that progressive collapse started.
And you had that intense heat probably weakened the structure as well.
As I looked for answers, I found Shyam Sundar of NIST stating, "The buildings were not brought down by explosives. Until then, I didn't know explosives were even in the conversation. And like hearing a child claim innocence before a question is even posed, it had my eyebrow raised."
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
While researching the official government story, I saw a news flash that the 9/11 families wanted an investigation of World Trade Center 7. I was a bit surprised. Why would they be questioning the official story? That seemed a little out there, but who could be more invested than they were? So I listened to what they had to say.
our perception of what happened on September 11th is very different from the general public's perception, I'd say, for the most part.
I believe that the public is still uninformed about most of the issues that are surrounding them.
I just don't think the public at all knows. They want to believe.
I think the truth sometimes can be frightening.
There's some deep, deep explaining to do.
The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated.
We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
Nobody ever stopped to have a scientific investigation. A scientific investigation. A scientific...
What did these families know that I didn't? It's obvious once you look, they've been trying to say something is wrong, and we need to look at 9/11 more closely, especially Building 7. And they weren't alone. I found an endless sea of organizations, rallies, websites, books, and films about that day, but I never really heard about any of them on the evening news. The families and many others were pointing to World Trade Center Building 7, the last one to collapse. I wanted to research what was so special about Building 7. We were only a few days away from launching my new business when I shared with Betsy that I didn't think there was any harm in pushing it back a bit so I could look into Building 7 for myself. This news, combined with the controversial nature of what I was looking into, was met with less than enthusiastic support by my wife, even though she tried to hide it. It was understandable. Remember, our baby was due in a few months, and I was suggesting changes, but they weren't too big and she was okay with it, so I moved forward. And that's how it began. I didn't know it then, but I set us on a course that would lead our marriage to the brink of disaster. But that hadn't happened yet, so let's pick this back up at Building 7. Here are some basic facts. World Trade Center 7, which was located in downtown New York City, is sometimes called the Salomon Brothers Building, but is most commonly referred to as Building 7. With construction beginning in 1984, it benefited from many modern advancements in building technology. It was a 47-story, steel-framed, fireproof skyscraper standing 550 feet tall. It was 300 feet from the nearest tower, the North Tower, or about a football field away. Even though it was one of the largest buildings in Manhattan, it looked small next to the Twin Towers. In September of 2001, Building 7 would have been the tallest building in 33 states. It collapsed at 5:20 p.m. the afternoon of September 11th. Even though Building 7 was not hit by an airplane, the official explanation for all 3 buildings that collapsed was that intense fires weakened the steel, resulting in total symmetrical building failure. The official story goes on to state that in Building 7, column 79 gave out first, starting a progressive failure of the remaining columns, which allowed the building to fall almost as fast as a bowling ball would into its own footprint. If a building that size accidentally collapsed on any other day, it would have been as famous as the Titanic sinking. Yet according to a 2006 Zogby poll, 43% of Americans never even heard of Building 7. Building 7 housed the CIA's largest station outside of Washington, D.C. It also contained the Secret Service's biggest field office. The IRS, Department of Defense, and the SEC also occupied entire floors. The mayor's emergency management bunker was located in the building, but ironically, it wasn't used that day. The rest of the tenants were primarily banks such as Solomon Smith Barney, which occupied the top 17 floors. Many government and SEC documents for cases primarily against Wall Street banks, but also including WorldCom and Enron, were destroyed, crippling the investigation into thousands of cases. At this point, I didn't think anything was too far out of place. I'd come across a few strange things, but I wasn't thinking conspiracy or anything like that. I did, however, find it a little odd that falling debris could set off a chain of events, ultimately turning Building 7 into a pile of rubble. However, I really didn't understand the physics involved, at least not yet. But I didn't need to understand physics to find it pretty strange that the whole building would crash through itself. I've played with Legos. Tip over? Maybe. But to pile drive through itself didn't make sense. At least the Twin Towers were hit by planes, but no plane hit Building 7. Sometimes it's easier for me to tackle complex issues with simple metaphors, so I thought of a stove. Then I imagined what kind of materials would I need to add to the fire so that all 4 legs would collapse simultaneously, and I couldn't answer it. Better yet, let's say I stacked 10 stoves on top of each other, and then I welded them together to better represent any of the buildings that collapsed that day. Now I go and light, let's say, the 7th stove up on the stack. What could cause the 7th stove's legs to give out simultaneously and cause every other stove below it and above it to break apart into tiny pieces, crashing to a pile of rubble in a few seconds? And how could that happen 3 times in a row? After breaking it down, I felt a little pit in my stomach for the first time, but I assured myself that I must be missing something. With that said, it was time to take a crash course in high-rise fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history, but let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers, yet it stood. The underlying structure wasn't even weakened. In fact, it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central building in Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building, burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired, and it is in use today. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, One Meridian Plaza, 1991, burned for 18 hours. It stood. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, burned for 6 hours in 2009. It stood. Chechny's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and on and on. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant dates include February 13, 1975, when the 9th to the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening of the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Some fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And in 1993, it survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was, of course, damage from the bomb, which had to be repaired, but through it all, the towers have always stood. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over and stay connected. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel-framed high-rise in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire-resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows,
that means that the fires were oxygen starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
The bottom line is this. Steel-framed high-rises don't collapse, especially into their own footprint, because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved. But the kerosene or the jet fuel just can't explain it. Set aside for a minute that only 2 of the buildings were subjected to kerosene. Now think of a kerosene lamp or a kerosene heater. In the history of kerosene lamps, I have never heard of one being melted because the fires were too hot. In fact, the World Trade Center fires were starved of oxygen and therefore heat. You can see it in the black smoke coming from the towers. Yet molten iron was found in the rubble of all 3 buildings. Something else had to provide the heat and energy needed to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel in any of those 3 buildings. And unless you work for NIST, scientists agree that neither jet fuel, nor the furnishings inside those buildings could have heated the steel enough to melt it. I was starting to realize that something else must have been involved in the collapse of at least Building 7, if not all 3. Okay, maybe airplanes weakened the structure of the Twin Towers, which we'll be looking into more deeply later. For now, believe it or not, planes have hit many buildings throughout history and none fell. Of course, none were hit with planes as large as the ones on 9/11, but that still leaves Building 7. I couldn't explain it. Can you tell me that if I throw a flaming chunk of metal off of one building, I can make the building next to it collapse in on itself a few hours later? Why do demolition companies even exist if you can just light a few random fires and wait for an implosion? Maybe the steel structure in Building 7 was so badly damaged from falling debris that the entire structure was compromised. It still can't explain the symmetrical collapse, but I looked anyway. Other buildings that have suffered severe structural damage by natural disaster or bombs didn't disintegrate into rubble piles. They stayed together in some way. Even the buildings in the Trade Center complex that suffered worse damage than Building 7 didn't collapse in on themselves. This uneasy feeling was growing, but there was much more to understand about Building 7's collapse, especially before I started jumping to conclusions in my own head. I needed to hear from some experts.
It just didn't add up, the way the whole thing sort of pile drove itself into the ground and all at near free fall speed.
Collapses straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
The animation sequence from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their model, their mathematical model of the collapse of Building Number 7. And they have the inside members, that one column gave way, which they claim resulted in the collapse of all the surrounding members, and then this precipitated a global collapse. This would just not be physically possible for a gravitational collapse.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense. Regardless of the engineering, the logic tells you that if you have a single failure at some random point in the building, that the entire building is not going to collapse. Buildings don't break that way.
The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside
at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The building would want to topple over. It would want to bend over that weakened area and topple over sideways. What we saw the structure came straight down upon itself.
It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
At free fall speed, that's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
If you took a billiard ball and dropped at the height of the Twin Towers, and you just merely stopped it and started at every floor in free fall, it would take over 1.5 minutes to reach the ground. The buildings were down in 10 seconds.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it. And there's some delay there. And then the next floor falls with 2 floors, and there's some more delay.
The buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. And when it's all finished, the outside walls from the lower floors are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building.
So it's fiction to say that a building as modern as World Trade Center 7 comes down with no resistance.
Doesn't add up.
The official explanation was dead wrong.
Just not possible.
Not possible.
Just doesn't make sense. It's not how it works.
It can't happen.
Never before in history.
It just can't happen.
Well, that's just nonsense.
And that cannot happen.
Couldn't happen.
It's fiction.
There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
This was a controlled event.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
In short, the evidence is clear. We are witnessing not the collapse of a building, but its demolition.
At the time, I was thinking, wait a minute. My heart was pounding, my adrenaline was flowing, and I had a knot in my stomach. You know, the collapse never looked right to me, but then again, I never really thought that it defied the laws of physics. My imagination started to run wild.
Could the hijackers have wired the buildings? Maybe the government didn't want us to know how really lax their security was, and that's why they covered up this fact. Maybe it was pre-wired for some reason, but that made no sense. If it was a controlled demolition, it would explain how much of these buildings were reduced to ash. It would explain why the towers fell after burning for only an hour or so. It would explain why they imploded instead of tearing apart. It would explain why they all fell at close to free fall speed. It sure looked like a controlled demolition, in retrospect. I couldn't stop at this point. I needed to know more. Late nights, coffee, research. My life was changing before my very eyes. I had taken my very first step down the rabbit hole. Little did I know how much deeper it would go. By now I knew that fires didn't bring down the buildings. And even if fire could somehow melt steel, the buildings would not have fallen in on themselves. They would have tipped over or torn apart. I was starting to find credible people talking about controlled demolitions and the use of explosives and molten steel. My mind kept wandering, trying to imagine how all this tied together. But first, I still needed to understand more about what happened. Impact-synchronized booms were explosions seemingly timed with the plane strikes in the seconds before and after the collisions. Pre-collapse pops were explosions heard all over the buildings from the time of the first plane impact until Building 7 fell. The final booms and crackle are the main body of explosives, which are detonated over the span of a few seconds, leading up to and through the collapse. It seems that explosives went off in different parts of the Trade Center when each plane hit. William Rodriguez, a 20-year maintenance employee of the Trade Center who was decorated for saving many people that day, was in the building when the first plane hit. Let's hear what he and a few others had to say about a subterranean explosion coinciding with the first plane hit.
It was a huge explosion that came from under my feet, meaning that it came from the sub-levels between B2 and B3. And then there was a huge explosion at the top of the building. You could hear the difference from the bottom and all the way through the top.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb.
Just get out of the tunnel and it blew.
The subway tunnel?
Yeah.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement.
came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
What that man is describing sounds like an explosion, not jet fuel dripping down elevator shafts, as stated in the official version. Why did so many people hear an explosion below ground? A collision above might crack or break some windows, but I didn't understand how that could tear up the lobby, especially when you consider the base of the building would have felt the least amount of vibration as the shockwave was absorbed by the 95 floors above it. Remember, these images are from before the second plane strike, meaning these images were recorded between 8:46 and 9:03 a.m. The only thing that had happened so far is a plane impact around the 95th floor of this building.
Right away, a guy from the Port Authority told him the damage was somewhere above the 78th floor. And all you had to do was look around. It was obvious. Something had happened right there in the lobby.
FDNY fireman John Schrader, whose engine company 10 is across the street from the Trade Center complex, arrived at the first tower hit, the North Tower, within 10 minutes of the impact.
We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. You know, something, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped.
With so many people talking about the explosions at street level, it would make sense that early reports had the FBI and others looking into bombs at the base of the buildings.
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it.
I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. There was another explosion which took place. According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Jenny Carr was recording a business meeting near the Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. on 9/11 when we hear the basement explosion. 9 seconds later, we can hear the first plane hitting the North Tower.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building, then another plane hit the other building.
Let's discuss these pre-collapse pops. From a distance, they sound like pops, but they're actually pretty powerful. Hundreds of secondary explosions were reported at various times prior to the collapse of all three buildings. In a controlled demolition, these bangs are shaped charge explosives blowing out beams before a collapse. They can be programmed to go off hours or seconds before an implosion. These were mostly reported as secondary explosions by the first responders and reporters.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impact.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
The final booms and crackle are like the grand finale of a fireworks show. In a controlled demolition, the vast majority of the explosives are set to go off in an ordered fashion over the span of a few seconds as the building collapses. Depending on distance, this can sound like a rumble, booms, or crackling.
That feeling that there was something else, that there may have been something else that brought those buildings down.
There was a lot of talk there in New York of another explosion prior to the collapse of the first building.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
In this footage, which has been slowed, you can see white smoke emanating from the ground floor before the collapse wave arrives. It's an unsteady camera, but keep in mind whoever recorded this was running for their life. It was like watching a stunt car explode before it crashes at the bottom of the cliff. In this image, recently released by a Freedom of Information Act request, police department photographer captured an explosion originating at the base of the South Tower, just before the first tower collapsed. The explosions and shockwave before Building 7's collapse were captured in different ways.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shockwave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out.
In the end, the evidence of explosions was ignored by the organizations behind the official version, like NIST, FEMA, Popular Mechanics, and the 9/11 Commission. My independent search continued. Up next, the kink in the roof. It's not necessary for there to be a kink in the roof of an imploding building, but when it does happen, it's a pretty sure indication of a controlled demolition. The roof can only kink in when the central support columns are blown out first, meaning the destruction of the building is coming from inside it, not outside. This is done by design so the building falls in on itself. The kink in Building 7 is clearly visible to the naked eye. Controlled demolitions are designed to let the top of the building fall through its inner core columns, which is typically the strongest part of any building. Watch the penthouse of Building 7 sink into the floor below it just before the collapse begins. Squibs. Squibs are the sixth indicator on our list. In demolition vernacular, squibs refer to visible blasts from explosive charges. Often they are visible through mistiming or malfunction in some way. Usually they are hidden in the debris cloud. In simple terms, squibs are visual evidence of explosives. Squibs were recorded from the moment of the first plane impact through the collapse of the last tower. For me, they went unnoticed until I looked at the video more closely. These stills captured squibs as the towers collapsed. The official version stated these squibs were compressed air caused by the pancaking floors, which squeezed air to the point of bursting out a window. The seal of the building was already broken when the collapse began. Logically, if it was compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance through the broken part of the building. It shouldn't have knocked out a window here or a window there, as many as 40 floors below the blast wave.
Naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The following clips show multiple squibs popping out, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes dozens of floors away from each other. Of all the 9/11 information I've come across, this may have been the easiest to spot. Yet it provided me with one of those stark moments in which the reality of 9/11 sunk in to a new level. In this clip, notice how the squib occurs before the floors above reach the blast ejection point. Not all squibs, however, were easy to spot. Remember how we discussed explosions that were timed to go off with the plane impacts? Well, this is the first plane impact. Notice the dark brown smoke coming out of the top floor of the tower. This smoke is already dissipating before the plane strikes the building. In this segment, the NBC camera is pointed at the North Tower. The first tower hit. In a few seconds, the second tower is going to be hit. You'll know it when it happens because of the reporter's voice and the fireball in the lower left corner of the screen. Now keep your eye on the east facade, the one on the left. Notice how several tiny explosions go off as the second plane hits the other building, perhaps in an effort to mask some necessary work prior to its demolition, as I was thinking at the time.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit.
The seventh characteristic of a planned implosion is what's called a demolition wave. It's the path of destruction in a controlled demolition. It is a visible wave of explosions moving down the columns of a building just ahead of or at the speed of gravity. This array of synchronized explosives is timed to blow out floors beneath the collapse wave as the floors above reach the floors below, thus allowing a drop at approaching freefall speed. Again, let's slow down the film for some of these. When slowed down, you can see how the explosions are timed to go off, floor by floor. In this clip, you can clearly see a demolition wave proceeding down a column mostly hidden by the umbrella of the falling debris pile. Look to the right of the black line. It's a bit grainy because of the zoom. Here it is again without the black line. You can see synced explosives cutting a path down the building. The demolition wave can be hard to see with an untrained eye because it happens so fast. I've tried to highlight a few more examples in the following clips. Often buildings being demolished will have a mesh around them to keep projectiles from shooting away. In the case of the Twin Towers, there were thousands of pieces of steel jettisoned out much further than they could have if it were a gravitational collapse. Some pieces were ejected laterally over 600 feet. Some of these pieces weighed several tons. Let's listen to what a few experts had to say on the topic.
Window mullions and things went up and out. That kind of stuff can't happen with just pure air pressure of floors getting sandwiched together.
Large, multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The fragments which are being, which is coming out of the tower, obviously being kicked out by an explosive action.
And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
I'm no physicist, but if this was a gravitational collapse, there is no way that multi-ton beams can land 2 football fields away. I've lived in high-rises my whole life, and I've dropped things off my balcony, things like shoes and computer monitors. All they do is fall straight down. Even aerodynamic items like plates never ended up across the street. In some of these clips, you can see projectiles actually propelled upward, forming an arc. If this were a gravitational collapse, pieces could not be shot upward. And consider the pieces we see. The small pieces weigh a few pounds and the biggest pieces weigh several tons. In this clip, a multi-ton steel box column had so much lateral force that it pierced the building across the street. To give you an idea of its size, here you can see a construction worker standing at the base of the box column being installed. If I can't chuck a shoe more than 150 feet from the 50th floor of my building, how much force do you need to get a multi-ton steel girder to triple that? I could pretty much rule out a gravitational or progressive collapse with the physical dynamics I'd seen with my own eyes. And I found it ironic that the only part left standing was the base of the building. Even though the whole building landed on it, it was the only part of the building whose columns did not become dismembered. Perhaps that says something about the difficulty in wiring the atrium of the towers. And maybe these columns at the base did what the rest of the building should have done, and that is stay together in some way. Just a personal observation I'd made at the time. Of course I've been wondering how the hijackers wired the buildings. It was the only thing that still made any sense, even if barely. But I stopped wondering how the hijackers did it when I learned what was found in the Ground Zero dust. Even though the cleanup and removal of the Ground Zero evidence began within hours of the attacks, not all of it was removed. Many different dust samples were analyzed by scientists all over the world, and what they concluded put the final nail in the coffin of the official story for me. We touched on thermite earlier, but we're going to look into it more deeply for reasons you'll soon understand. Thermite is a chemical mixture, usually of metal oxide and aluminum powder, with several variations. It's often used in fireworks, underwater welding, and military weapons. It can also be used to cut steel beams. When thermite is detonated, it leaves traces of itself in the debris, like perfectly round microscopic spheres of iron, and unexploded thermite itself, both of which were found in the Ground Zero dust. The fact that explosive residue was found in the dust didn't surprise me, at least not by now. I already knew in my heart it was a controlled demolition. What rocked me was the type of thermite found. You see, it was a special type of thermite called nanothermite, and it meant that the odds that the hijackers could have done this dropped to near zero. My belief system kept taking more hits, which we'll discuss in a bit. For now, though, let's have the experts walk us through the basics.
In 3 different samples from 3 independent researchers, the R.J. Lee Company, the USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work. All 3 separately found these microspheres
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres.
Now I also present to you the real truth of 9/11 and why 9/11 is a false flag terror attack, a facilitated terror attack for that matter, and that 9/11 is basically the new Pearl Harbor. And 9/11 is the new Pearl Harbor when you think about it. I mean, basically that's what it is.
The equipment they encountered in the Boeing cockpits on September 11 was similar to the simulators they had trained on. But this is false. For example, the only simulator Hani Hanjour is known to have ever trained in is the Boeing 737, an airplane designed in the 70s, with a totally different cockpit from the 757 he is alleged to have hijacked on September 11. If anything, his training would have confused him, not helped him in any way. Another argument by the debunkers is that all the hijackers really had to do once in the cockpits was to set the automatic pilot in order to reach their targets.
Perché è una banalità sconcertante, me lo sono fatto spiegare, è come fare un SMS sul telefonino. E l'aereo va automaticamente a raggiungere la destinazione richiesta. Quindi io faccio, non so, JFK e lui mi porta all'aeroporto Kennedy. Appena io sono in vista dell'aeroporto Kennedy, prendo in mano i comandi e mi schianto contro le torri.
But this is hardly what happened on September 11. Dave Bottiglia is the air traffic controller who followed the hijacking of United 175.
Now as I'm watching, United 175 makes a hard left-hand turn and starts climbing. Not only did he make a sharp turn, but he also climbed 3,000 feet in a matter of approximately 1 minute, which is a very fast rate of climb. This is something that we have never seen before.
After the sudden ascent, the plane started a breathtaking descent toward the ground.
We were counting down the altitudes, and they were descending right at the end at 10,000 feet per minute. That is absolutely unheard of for a commercial jet.
This is certainly not the way the automatic pilot would have taken you to Kennedy Airport.
It is unbelievable for the passengers in the back to withstand that type of force as they're descending. They're actually nosing the airplane down and doing it what I would call a power dive.
At 9:01 a.m., United 175 is hurtling at more than 400 miles per hour toward the Statue of Liberty and New York Harbor.
One of the controllers started counting out the altitudes, and he says, my God, he's going down at 8,000 feet a minute. Now it's 10,000 feet a minute. And he counted off 8, 6, 4, and he says, my God, he's in the ground on the next hit.
But he was not. According to the official version, Marwan al-Sheikhi, a 23-year-old who has never flown a jet before in his life, levels the course, visually identifies the target, and performs a spectacular banking maneuver that brings the 767 to hit the South Tower under the world's astonished eyes. Question: Marwan al-Sheikhi had never flown a jet before in his life, let alone a huge airliner. How was he able to perform ascents of 3,000 feet per minute and plunges of 10,000 feet per minute while keeping full control of the plane? And why would he want to take such unnecessary risks, including collisions with other airliners, instead of flying safely with the autopilot towards the intended target? Ziad Jarrah, the alleged hijacker of Flight 93, wasn't known for his piloting skills either. As reported by the 9/11 Commission in July 2001, he had asked to fly the Hudson Corridor near Manhattan with a small private plane. But because Hortman Flight School deemed Jarrah unfit to fly solo, he could fly this route only accompanied by an instructor. Yet we are asked to believe that only 2 months later, the same person was able to fully control a 100-ton airliner and perform some extreme descending maneuvers observed by Cleveland's air traffic controllers.
I see this plane climbed up from his assigned altitude to 35,000 feet to 41,000 feet, turned around and aimed right back at where we were, and descended rapidly. And when a plane descends too fast, the computer can't keep up with it.
Ziad Jarrah had never flown a jet before in his life, let alone a large airliner, and even his experience with small airplanes was rather poor. How could he perform a descent so fast that the computer can't keep up with it while maintaining full control of the plane, and why would he need to take such an unnecessary risk, including collisions with other airplanes, instead of safely flying with the autopilot towards the intended target? But the feat of the century must be awarded to Hani Hanjour, a hopeless amateur who is alleged to have been at the controls of American 77. As he finally reached Washington and had the Pentagon in sight, Hani Hanjour did not make the easy choice and just plunge the plane onto the roofs of the building. He instead disconnected the autopilot and performed a hand-flown, high-speed descending maneuver of 330 degrees that brought him to lose sight of the target again while forcing him to a much more difficult approach close to the ground. Seen from above, the Pentagon offers some 30 acres of unobstructed target. Hitting it anywhere on the roofs would have caused a major devastation and possibly thousands of casualties. Coming in from the side instead, the approach is filled with obstacles, and the target is reduced to a tiny strip of cement coming at you at 500 miles an hour. The debunkers, however, seem to have a good explanation for this apparently illogical maneuver.
Normalmente l'aereo dovrebbe scendere in picchiata. Allora si chiede a un pilota e il pilota ti dice subito: guarda che quella è la manovra più difficile, la fa un pilota esperto. Un pilota di scarsa competenza usa l'aereo come se fosse un camion bomba, ossia vola orizzontalmente, vola basso, centra l'edificio.
This very question has already been posed to professional pilots, but the answer was not what Attivissimo claims.
Se lei dovesse simulare il volo di uno che vuole colpire il Pentagono,
esatto, se
la
volessi
rotta quale
essere
sarebbe?
sicuro lo colpirei sicuramente da questa parte qui.
Cioè, per essere sicuro arriverebbe dall'alto così?
Arrivando qui perché o si colpiscono questi edifici, diciamo i primi che vengono, oppure si colpiscono gli edifici che sono subito dopo e quindi si crea comunque un elevato danno.
Flying a jet near the ground instead does require some major skills, even for the most seasoned pilot.
Lei, che ha tante ore di esperienza di volo, riuscirebbe a portare questo aereo negli ultimi 500 metri, da qui a qui, a 850 km all'ora?
E dovrei metterci veramente tanto impegno. La prima difficoltà sarebbe quella di volare attaccato a terra. Lo so per esperienza diretta, avendo fatto volo militare a bassa quota.
Perché il terreno corre via.
Certo, corre a una velocità incredibile. Quindi credo che chi ha fatto questa attività possa capire cosa vuol dire stare a 10 metri da terra, 5 metri da terra con un aeroplano che pesa 110-120 tonnellate lanciato a 900 km all'ora. Basta toccare la close e schizza via.
Come si fa a pilotare un aereo a 530 miglia all'ora a rasoterra? È possibile?
Come diceva il collega, è estremamente difficile, è complesso anche perché un piccolissimo intervento sul piano verticale fa salire o scendere l'aeroplano, per cui anche un pilota abbastanza allenato avrebbe delle grosse difficoltà.
The debunkers insist that the maneuver would have been doable even by an amateur like Hani Hanjour.
La manovra è tutt'altro che acrobatica, è una virata molto ampia.
Il y a des journalistes aux Pays-Bas qui ont dit on va voir, on va faire le test.
To prove their point, the debunkers refer to a documentary by Dutch television in which the Pentagon attack is replicated in a flight simulator.
Waar waarschuwt het vliegtuig nu voor?
Het vliegtuig waarschuwt dat de